Well, thank you very much. There we go. Thank you very much. And yeah, I think just to say, we're probably going to have questions at the end. So if you make a note of the questions and then put them in the chat or raise a hand or something, then I think that's the plan for that. I think as Kate was saying, my background is that worked as a professional ecologist since about 2002-3, and then on from there, I sort of ended up coming back to the family farm at a similar time, and was farming a lot of nature reserves and doing conservation grazing back in the day. And with the ecologist background, the focus for me was always trying to maximize the ecological benefit of farming systems. And what I could see is a lot of the ecological output on farms was funded by stewardship, and I was always concerned that that could go if food shortage or policies change, politics change all the time. And so how important it was for family farms, for the cattle in these environmental systems to also pay the bills and to work. Because at that time I was getting paid to graze nature reserves, but the cattle systems themselves that I had on them were not really profitable. They might have been break even just. Some years they wouldn't have been. And then through a holistic management course, and starting holistic management in 2012, then a course in 2013, we started looking at holistic management and found that we could then cash flow using a holistic management framework as a basis for our production system and how we manage the grass and the cattle. And we could make a good profit, and that allowed us to grow our farm slowly but surely from about 40 acres small farm, really small farm, up to farming over 1,000 acres now and 150 pedigree Aberdeen Angus cows. One of the key things with trying to make those systems profitable was making sure you had the right cows. And particularly when I started out with the Aberdeen Angus breed, initially really looking at those with the high EBVs and the high growth, I lost a lot of money and got pretty close to the edge a few times, because if you're buying in pedigree heifers at 1,800, 2,000 pounds, and then 12, 24 months later, they're disappearing as a cull cow because they're empty, because they don't have the fertility in our system, then that's not something you can do. And the other thing I found out as well the hard way was that sometimes the problems don't show up straight away. So you might, if there's a slight energy deficit in the sit between what the cow needs and what the environment can produce, then over time you're going to slowly just take the energy off that cow. She might lose body condition a little bit year by year, and you might end up with her empty at 4 or 5 years old. So it can take quite a long time to find out you've got the wrong genetics, because really she should be having a calf every year until she's sort of 10 or 15, ideally, and we want cows that can do that for these systems to be profitable. So so learn that the hard way, and then but also an awful lot of the content of this has been from what I've learned from other people, and from reading other people's work. Dr. Jan Bonsma, the scientist we'll come to later, but a lot of his work has been integral in terms of getting that right with the management of fertility. And then people within PFLA as well. And Simon, a lot of you will know Simon Cutter, who he saw I was doing this webinar the other day and gave me a ring for a chat to make sure I was covering all the right points. And but he has got an encyclopedic knowledge, and I really think PFLA and any members should try and make the most of him, because he's an incredible resource on all of this stuff as well. So yeah, that's a bit of background on us. We're taking on another farm this year, so we're slightly increasing our acreage from there. But we want grass-fed bulls sold into other businesses, and our aim really, if I think about our goals for the business, from me and my partner Lizzie, we're farming together, is we really want to try and make sure that every Pasture Fed farm, every regenerative farm has cattle that work in their system, because if they don't work, it's not going to be good for these systems. People get turned off this kind of management. And I think key thing really is that farms can do this themselves. You can often select on farm. You don't have to come to a bull salesman like me to go to buy the genetics. A lot of the selection you can do on your female lines to improve things. And so I think that's just really, hopefully we'll be able to give you some clear things that you can follow on your farms to improve the genetic stock that you're dealing with and to eliminate the problems that you have. So thinking about what we want from a cow or a ewe, essentially in our systems, we really want something really simple, is a marketable calf every year, on time, problem free. Now, you can achieve that with inputs or without, but one comes with a lot of cost and not much reward. It depends what your goals are. If you love showing cattle, if you just love feeding cattle, my dad loves feeding cattle, then that can be something that you could take a different system. But this is, we're talking about grass-fed cattle today, so it's a different sort of thing. But some people don't even aim for, a problem-free system. In fact, they sometimes seem to aim for systems that create problems, and whether people are talking about having cesareans or pedigree Charolais, having calves every 18 months because they can't do any more than that. Constant foot trimming and labour costs in relation to cattle that become the norm and part of our farming activity if we're not careful. And actually, it's probably not the best thing for us, and it's probably not the best thing for the cows either. So we need to think about what we want to do. What's our context? What are our goals? And I think in pasture-fed systems, and certainly within holistic management, we're looking to try and maximize our solar dollars versus the paper dollars. So everything that we can kind of get for free from the environment, from the fact that the sun, well, it used to shine, and it definitely still rains. But the key thing is whatever we can get for free from our environment, maximize that, because we can in agriculture base our production systems on inputs and pushing production. But as a rule of thumb, with those sorts of systems, you tend to, the bottom third on running those systems tend to drop out about every 10 years. So it's not something that keeps the family farm going unless you're getting bigger and bigger on those. You have contacts finishing 10,000 plus cattle a year. It's a very different sort of scale to what many of us operate on. So what we're really looking for in terms of what we want to do is have a maximum sustainable profit that we can sustain each year. So not maximum production, from what the environment can provide us, without having to go and buy lots of inputs. And growing our business from 40 acres up to where we are now, up to 150 cows, we've had to do that on in a low cost basis. We haven't been able to afford inputs in order to grow. If I had money to buy things, I bought cows, and because they're a productive asset. Whereas, if you're buying fertilizer or feed and those kinds of things, these are costs that, depending on the price you receive, and we're often in agriculture price takers instead of price makers, those are things that may or may not make you money. And so we want to avoid those sorts of paper dollars and aim for the solar dollars. And I have seen the forecast, and it says that we're going to get some sunshine in the next week or two. So things are looking up, grass is growing. So we need to define what whole and what that, if we're trying to maximize our production from the environment, we have to remember that the environment is limited. There's a lot of fairy tale good news stories around regenerative agriculture, that it's all a miracle and you're going to have endless production and you're going to 10 times your stocking rate and all of this sort of stuff. But the reality is that, we have to follow the laws of physics, and there is a maximum amount of energy available to us in each growing season. So we want to try and maximize our use of that energy, however we can. And if we're in cows, then, we have to have the right cows. Now, we can increase the available environment over time with good management. So maybe with our grazing management, we can increase the amount of grass available to us. But, there's a risk element to that as well, because if we're relying on good management, then the trouble is that can't always be sustained. And so, for example, in years like this, where it's just, we outwinter, and you have a weather year like this, and, kind of everything almost goes out the window. And so, but if you're relying on that alone, And if you have animals that perform only when the management is really good, then those animals will not perform in a year when things are really bad. And so that might be out of your control with the management. It's either that or you've just got to, you know, fork out a load of cash to try and keep them in good body condition. Because once you lose that body condition on them, it's a long journey back. You then have to have an animal that is sort of coasting in the system. Because if she's struggling or she's really pushing to try and produce what you want to get from her, and then she has a bad year or a bad weather year and she loses body condition, it's really hard for her to gain that back if she's walking that knife edge of production between the energy needs and the energy available in the system. And so that's something we have a consideration of in our young bulls as well. So when we wean the bulls, we'll let them have a good summer at grass, and in October, you can see there's actually some videos of our bulls on our Instagram channel, the ones and that had a really good summer at grass in October. We've got a shine on the coat, looking fat and lovely. And then through that second winter, we then push them and we limit intake. We do not let them be completely full every day, and we see who can handle it with body condition. And that way we know that the animals will perform in situations where the environment is limited by the weather, extreme weather, and we seem to be getting more and more extreme weather. So a lot of this is about being resilient and making sure that, you know, it's so incredibly exciting that so many people are moving towards these regenerative ecological farming systems. It's everything I hoped we might have done in the last 20 years is all coming to fruition. But it also is a big worry that if we don't have the right animals and people lose too much money, or a lot of farmers looking at the people transitioning, looking over the hedge, speaking down the pub about it, and if they see the cows not dealing with it, if it's going the wrong way or poor performance, poor animal welfare, then that's not good for us either, for our movement. So it's really important that we have cattle that can survive and thrive in these systems, and that's what we want. I'm going to skip through some of this because I don't think everybody or that many people in the group are going to be looking for the total maximum performance, but with just some key principles that we can look at. A lot of the science, so you could call it that, around performance data is based around the fact that of people using feed efficiency trials where they're trying to basically put as much feed into an animal as possible and see which animal out of that cohort grows. From the mean. And when you're breeding animals, everything tends to revert back to the middle of the bell curve. And so rate of improvement diminishes the
Sorry, everyone. I think we lost Rob there. Apologies, everyone. We seem to have lost Rob. I was just ascertaining that it was his connection and not mine. We're just going to give him a call and see if we can get him back online. I'm going to pause the recording for a minute as well.
So the key thing that we need to remember is the environment is limited, and there's only so much energy that we have available. We can't create it out of thin air. So first law of thermodynamics, we can transform energy. So we can take it from the sun into the grass, take the carbohydrates, the carbon through photosynthesis. We can transform it again. And when the cows eat it, and it goes into the rumen and provides them with energy and protein and sugars. But you can't just create it out of thin air. And then the other thing is that we have entropy. So the transforming process from one type of energy to another costs energy. And so we're losing the amount of energy available we have when we do that process. And so we're limited in two ways, and we can't overcome this. The only way we can do is by constantly adding energy in from another source, which isn't, in the long term, isn't sustainable. So you can add energy in, and that might be through fertilizer, it could be through feed, it could be through diesel, whatever you're doing to boost production of grass, so you've got more feed, effectively more energy coming to the cows. But the more you do this, it comes at a cost. We know these costs just going up and up, they're not going down. But we need cows that work for us, not the other way around. We need cows that don't have big costs. We don't worm our cattle routinely. They only get native grasses, no high sugar varieties, and reseeds every few years, which all costs more energy going into the system that we're having to put in. And inevitably, this means that we've got smaller cows to cope with this, with the amount of environment, but also means that those cows are finding it a walk in the park to getting calf every year and produce a marketable calf each year. So if you've got that, then it means you can keep our direct costs as low as possible, and that allows us to cash flow the business because we know every cow that we have makes us money. So like many of you, our cows are wintered outside, and we've done bale grazing for many years. I mentioned Simon Cutter. I think he was the first person I saw doing proper bale grazing over here, and we copied pretty quickly. He was doing it for many years. And yeah, many of our cows have never been in a shed. So you think about the costs. You need a shed. There's no dry bedding to buy, no high quality conserved forage to produce and store. And when the weather, and we have a winter like we had this year, a cold, wet winter, those days are real big challenge for them. And probably the biggest challenge we put on our cows is carrying the calves through the winter on them. And we wean at 10 months in March, hopefully onto growing grass. It's very slow this year. I'm sure you've all been experiencing that. But we've got all of our calves are now grazing on a grazing platform. We're out and going again. We hope to have the weather's looking to us. So that gives us the ability to have animals that are just working from what the sunshine provides for us. So this is a photo of one of our bale pods. I think there's 87 cows, in-calf cows in that group. And we were giving them about, I think they were getting about something like, I think it was 18 bales every week, something like that. And we just had those bales set out, just tipping them up, allowing them to eat them in position. And that's almost like a sacrifice paddock. Gets us through the worst of the end of winter, and we've just turned our cattle out of the sacrifice paddock they were in, so they've just been a week now out grazing, but that just allows us on, even though we're out winter everything, it just gives us the ability to do that, and it comes back pretty well. And then many of you bale grazing will know about the wildlife benefits of that too, but rolling bales out, always moving them onto fresh ground, keeps them looking healthy and keeps them doing well. So something we talk about in holistic management is community dynamics, which is effectively how the diversity that we work with comes together to form the ecosystem processes. And Alan Savory, who many of you will know as the founder of holistic management, when he talks about community dynamics, he talks about the fact that there's no such thing as a hardy animal. It's about environmental fit. And I guess what that means is more that it's about adaptation, or it's about how the animal actually fits to her environment. And in particular, if you think about red deer, for example, there's a pressure on the animals to be bigger and stronger in terms of the males and the stags that are fighting to stand a harem each year. And so there's selection pressure to be bigger and stronger. But at the same time, there's selection pressure on the females that they have to be able to raise young and reproduce year after year. And so the adaptation to those selection pressures has an impact, not just on the genome, but also on which genes are switched on and off, and epigenetics. And the epigenetics, epi means above, so above the genetic code, the impacts that the environment that switch those genes on and off, and then that leads to evolution and adaptation. So it's also worth thinking about those red deer in terms of population dynamics versus something that we have in agriculture and in cattle breeding is this very individual animal focus. So we'll look at the bull with the highest numbers, and we'll look at the one that grows the most, that has the most performance. But the key thing is really that it's the herd that's adapting and not the individual. And often, if you look in nature, might not want to copy this completely, but within nature, you'll see in red deer populations, some animals might be bigger, but they might only breed every other year. And some animals might be smaller, so they're less dominant, perhaps don't produce as many stags that breed, but they'll produce more females that will end up dominating the population. And so, because they breed every year. And so there's some really interesting things we can take away from that in terms of frame size and the impacts of that on the fecundity and the fertility of the animals that we're producing. So the environment that they're adapting to, and you can see this is Jan Bonsma. We'll talk about Jan Bonsma a bit later, but this is the Bonsma wheel of all the environmental impacts, and there's more than this. And so if you think about, cattle from Herefordshire or the Galloways from the North Country, they're adapted to the soils and the landscapes that they come from. And in many cases, we all know that the landscapes shape those animals, but also those animals shape those landscapes as well. And because they were so adapted to them. And, whether it's the Herdwick on a Cumbrian fell or, Hereford cattle in Herefordshire meadows, but the soil fertility, the soil type, the rainfall, the available nutrition, temperature, the light radiation, altitude, even latitude has an impact. If you move cattle more than, I think it's about more than 1,500 miles north or south, then you tend to get some significant problems with their. They take them a year or two to adapt to the new conditions, particularly with the differences in light, etc. So from North Coast to Scotland to Cornwall is enough to can create a problem. So they need to know their environment. They can feel their environment, and that's providing information to them all the time that they're adapting to. So how do we achieve that adaptation to the environment that we want? And I think we talked about the individual animal and why we've got to focus on that. If you look at it doesn't matter if it's Aberdeen, Angus, Hereford, Limousin, you name it. If you look at most of the magazines, and everything is focused on the bull. We think about, as a bull salesman, I should tell you all your answers are in the bull, but that's not the case. If you think about what they do is they do pass on the genetics, and that can be terminal, or it can be maternal genetics for the cow, depending on your choice of bull. When we think about what the cow does for you, it's carrying a calf for 9 months, whilst feeding another one for 10 months in our system. And you think about, she's the physiological center of production on your farm, and she's the receptor and the interpreter of all the environmental signals that are coming in, whether it's the grass she's eating, the weather patterns, the climate, you name it, the energy available. She's the one receiving that information and having an impact on it. The bull really hasn't got to do anything else than sort of maybe survive and fight and breed. It's a much easier job than she's got. She's got a lot more energy requirements on her. And so you have to wonder why we didn't focus on the feminine when it's obvious that she's that important to it. But, I used to hear from family and others, be told the bull's half your herd or the ram's half your flock. But is that correct? Genetic theory, Mendelian segregation, law of segregation, tells us that 50% of the genetics comes from the mother and 50% from the father. So if the bull covers, if you've got a herd of 30 cows, then the logic goes that 50% of the genetics in the resulting calves comes from that bull, whereas one cow is only 50% of one of those calves. And so the focus was always on the bull to change your genetics and move things forward. And because of that, and a lot of the assumptions, cattle geneticists and geneticists broadly abandon the importance of cow families in selection. In a past life, I used to work for the Rare Breed Survival Trust and working with the Farm Animal Genetics Committee at DEFRA, and a lot of the top scientists, people involved with Dolly the sheep, and some of the top people in the country, in the world even. And they would say that the cow family is a myth, that it's not important, and we need to focus on the bulls to improve the performance in our cattle, because everything's very linear. It's about numbers. It's about so-called science. But we didn't focus on that. And we talked a little bit about epigenetics as well. And so just what is that? We said it's above and over the genetics. But we also need to understand that whilst we have genetic change, which is coming just from the DNA of the genome, we also have epigenetic change, which a lot of that is about adaptation. So it's what those changes, the switches on and off of the gene, the genetic code, that are integral to how things appear and how they form, the phenotype of things. And if you think about a fertilized egg that then turns into a blastocyst, a collection of cells, then each of those cells are identical. There might be 8, 16, 32 cells at that point. They're all identical, but they're all going to split off. And whilst they're identical now, depending on which genes are turned on and off in those individual cells, some of them might be part of your fingernail bed, or they might be part of a bone, or a red blood cell, or a brain cell, or a part of your eye. And so those cells are going to look incredibly different, even though they have exactly the same genetic code. And that's essentially the best example of how epigenetics can create these transformational differences in phenotype just from which genes are switched on and off. Then if we look at the genome as a whole, we can and think about the animal as a whole, we can think about how we adapt to different things. So, for example, in people, if you drink too much alcohol, which you might have been doing with the bad weather, you might find, what you'll find is that your receptors in your body, particularly in your liver cells, will acknowledge this, and there'll actually be a switch. It's very quick, happens within 2 or 3 weeks, and that switch will go on, and it'll produce an enzyme that helps you break down alcohol more effectively. So thank goodness for epigenetics. If we think about cattle hide, we can get changes. That's obviously a change within a person's life within a few weeks. Cattle hide thickness can change in 2 or 3 years. I've taken on cattle on one of the farms, on a contract farm, where they were housed for 6-7 months of the year, and they were very thin-hided. But within 2 or 3 years, some of the cows really struggled to change, but some of them, we really noticed the difference, how their hides thickened when they were wintered out. And so that can change within life as well. And so that's an adaptation to the environment. We often think that, so you've got epigenetic changes that happen within life, within a few weeks, over a few years, but then you also have epigenetic changes that happen through generations. And these changes tend to happen through 2 or 3 generations it might take of that environmental signal for that switch on the gene to switch, and for it to change. And these things that change slower tend to be things like the energy requirements, the metabolic efficiency that link to the fit to the environment. So it's really important that how the epigenetics works. And we all know, if we've gone and bought a bull or a sheep, they might come from lines that look grass-fed or seem grass-fed, but if they've been fed for 2 or 3 generations, often those bulls or those females that you buy will just fall apart in a grass-fed system, because over 2 or 3 generations they've been used to much higher energy and so they've got higher growth rates and higher energy requirements because that's what they've come to expect. We know about Holocaust survivors and their offspring and the impacts of starvation on future generations putting on more fat in the future. So these things have an impact through generations as well. So they're very powerful. Now, the mitochondria are really important in that process as well. So you have the mitochondria within the cell, and within the mitochondria, as well as the DNA within the nucleus of the cell, you also have mitochondrial DNA, which is within the cell itself. And the mitochondria do some really important things. So they take a lot of the food that's processed into amino acids and then it's converted into ATP for energy for the animal. Mitochondria do all of that. They regulate all the cellular metabolism, cell death, and cell reproduction, the production of steroid hormones. And so obviously for fertility and breeding and our reproductive hormones is very important. Regulation of our innate immunity to our environment as well. So again, adaptation to the environment. Amino acid production, the breakdown of food, the growth and repair of body tissue. Essentially, we're talking about the resilience of animals within their environment. So they code for some of the most important things within the animal. And here's the thing. They have a higher rate of genetic mutation as well than DNA does. So this leads to a faster rate of adaptation, which makes sense that almost this is separated off from the genetic code itself. But these adaptations within the cells and within the animals itself can happen at a faster rate. And here's the thing though, 99% of all mitochondrial DNA in a calf comes from the female. It can be 100%, but more or less 99% most of the time. And so suddenly we're thinking about how important everything we said about the female line being the receptor of all that environmental stimuli. The fact that she has to produce, the bull doesn't really have to work throughout the year that hard, apart from maybe 60 days. But she's got to work all year. She's got to have a calf inside her while she's suckling her other calf. And so we think about that and the fact that she is the only one that passes on the mitochondrial DNA, which kind of makes sense from an evolutionary point of view when you really think about that. And how important is the feminine inheritance? And actually those old cowmen and women of the past who knew that cow family worked and that cow line worked, they were right. And whilst the scientists sort of mocked and decried them and said that was ridiculous and silly, and actually almost and really attempted to get rid of the ideas around cow families, it turns out they were right. Those old cowmen and women were right. And so that's got to form a real basis of what we choose when we're thinking about our cows and our replacements. And have a really good look at your cows, and your best cows are the ones to breed from, and really knowing where your female lines are is really important. And so that brings us to, this is Alenka. So she's ear tag number 634, and she's a lovely example of a feminine cow. So whilst you can see she's got a good hip on her, she's got a reasonable amount of back end for a female, she's got a perfect udder. This was taken a day or two after calving. She's got a real feminine shoulder, which we'll talk a little bit about later as well. But a lovely example of a fertile, productive cow. You can almost make out, just see as well, she's got really good heart room. So the distance between her front legs, she's got a real wide chest on her as well, for vital organ capacity, so heart and lungs, really important as well. You think about the difference between Steve Redgrave, Matthew Pinsent, Olympic rowers, and their heart and lung capacity can be almost double what a normal person is. Just have that genetic difference. And you get those genetic differences in animals too, comparative anatomy, that we can learn a lot from and select the things that work better for us. So there's your cow. She's got all of these environmental impacts on her. And it's also to say, just if we want things to adapt to the environment, then essentially they have to be in that environment. We and all animals and organisms are anti-fragile, in that we need stresses in order for us to adapt to those stresses. You know, if we shut ourselves away, for example, at COVID from all of the bugs in the world, then when we go back out into the world, we don't have that innate immunity to all the things we then encounter. In the same way as we've seen, if you stop everyone eating peanuts when they're pregnant, then you get a lot more peanut allergy. And so all of the ways that we evolve and adapt to our environment are, it's a genius way of operating that we've evolved, which is that we have to, if we go into an environment, then we'll adapt to it, but we have to stay in with it in order for us to do that. And so, it's one of the reasons we don't vaccinate. We find that just harsh selection on animals that have a problem disease-wise is as effective as vaccinations in terms of eliminating those problems. And if we think about the crutches that we provide to livestock, putting them in the shed, give them high energy feed, all the things that cost money, but actually prevent her from actually engaging with the environment that she has to live in. And no wonder we end up with high cost systems when we take away her ability to interact and adapt properly to her environment. So what can a cow actually stand? Friends in Canada running cattle at minus 40 degrees in the winter and getting 95% fertility rates on 500 cows. It's incredible what they can do when you look at it. So many of us in this sector, we know we want to produce within the bounds of what the environment can produce, and with a relatively fixed supply of energy. We need an animal whose energy requirements fall within what the environment can produce. It's really important. And that keeps your costs and risks down. It means that higher prices, however you achieve them, whether that's the market or through your marketing, means you increase your margins. So if you can, maybe you're selling beef direct or whatever you're doing, that gives you what you're going to be getting. So the more you can bring those costs down, the bigger margin you get. And so it has a much bigger impact. If you're in a system at the moment, okay, cattle prices are high, so your margin's up. The cattle prices are high, but probably fertilizers up, diesel costs are up, straw costs are up. So your margin doesn't look quite as good, even though you've got those high cattle prices. Now, with all those costs going up, they rarely go down. Once the price comes down again, you've got a loss instead of a profit. And so it's about that risk. There's no point risking the family farm just on ego of production. So this comes back to our first slide. We want a marketable calf every year, on time, problem free. And that is essentially, that sentence is this in a nutshell. Is this, this is what we want. That's all you need to really think about. And you do all your selection decisions are based on that sentence, and you won't go far wrong. In terms of what my cows need, fertile, so they get in calf first cycle if possible, maybe second cycle you'd allow. Maintain through the winter, maintain condition while in calf and with the calf at foot until it's 10 months old. They calf correctly and they pair bond, but they're still approachable. She cleans her calf. I can't hate it when a cow doesn't clean her calf. It often has something relating to a problem at calving or an interruption with the pair bond process. But if she cleans her calf, then you'll notice that if they encounter something that causes calf scours, coccidiosis, whatever it is, she'll clean that calf again and again, and then that's going into her and then back through her system, and then he's going to get antibodies through the milk, and you just see how quickly everything just cleans up. It was really important in terms of selection, I think. And we need to have a marketable calf that meets market requirements without being essentially docked on the rail, and a healthy calf in good body condition every year, easily within what the environment can provide. So you want something, it's like a walk in the park for her to produce you a calf each year. If she's losing too much body condition, or it's a little bit too, or she doesn't gain it back at the right times, it's a bit too much work on her, then you probably need a little bit less production from her, or a little bit less maintenance cost, energy maintenance cost for her to produce that calf for you. So where did we go wrong? Here you've got a slide, a picture of an animal that this was a champion bull And I think some of you may have heard the story at the Royal Welsh Show last summer, where the champion bull was a Belgian blue like this one, and it ended up that it couldn't actually walk around the show ring after winning the Belgian blue show. And so they actually put it on an open trailer just to parade it around the ring. And I think if that's where we're getting to, and this is what, this is where science has led us. If you follow the science, this is what we should all be doing. High growth rates, finishing cattle for the carbon at 16 months, because then it hasn't lived as long, and apparently the carbon emissions are less. We all know what rubbish all of that stuff is and how science can go wrong. But we really have to ask ourselves whether that's acceptable. And with all our numbers and with all our technology, but we look at, this is now 18 months old, I think, but cattle tracing service data on calving interval. The average calving interval is 426 days. That should be 365, really. Age at first calving, average of 34 months. Now, these are both averages. So that means there's an awful lot of people with worse averages than this across their herd. So that means more or less half are worse than this. US data, despite all of the progress in using EPDs and EBVs and growth figures last 30 years, the weaning weights on the calves in the US have not increased in 30 years. Now, the growth rate on those calves has increased once you put a lot of feed into them. So you could say that's working for the feeder. But that's not great for us if we're grass farmers, because those calves will want to grow and grow in our grass-fed systems until they're sort of 4 or 5 years old, and they'll just do it slower and they'll never finish. But the reason why the weaning rates haven't gone up is because the energy available in the environment is just not there. And so you can only grow as much as the environment provides the energy. And a lot of the calves on the dams will be in grass grazing systems, often outwintered in pretty harsh conditions. The only time they get to grow really is in the feedlot. So we look at the UK suckler cow profitability, despite higher prices, is still non-existent. And we now have bigger cows, that means slightly bigger calves, but have much higher energy and maintenance costs. So these are pretty big problems. So if we look at why did we go wrong on all of that? And a lot of it comes down to unintended consequences of, why does one animal grow more than another? If I'm doing this talk in public, then I'll often ask the audience. I've asked an audience of maybe 100 farmers in the past, why does one animal grow more than another? And I've not received a correct answer from farmers who grow cattle. They don't know why one grows more than another. And so if we think about how we grow and what happens, I can tell you the answer is essentially around hormone balance. So we have growth hormones and we also have reproductive hormones, and they're in balance with each other. When we select for growth, we're actually selecting for unbalancing that system, so that your growth hormones dominating the reproductive hormones for longer, so that the growth hormones, so the animal will grow and grow and keep growing. That's got unintended consequences, and can have a huge impact on fertility, because if you're essentially stifling in the reproductive hormones, it's not surprising that reproductive success is then affected. So we want to try and have a hormonally balanced animal, because as they grow up and reach sexual maturity, the reproductive hormones then dominate the growth hormones at the right age. Then what happens is the growth plates on the end of the long bones will close, and then they'll stop growing and they'll start developing and putting energy, instead of into growth, they'll put energy into the secondary sexual characteristics that you get in the bull. So the thoracic development you get in a bull, or you get the hip and pelvic development and the change that you have as a heifer becomes more cow-like, often before calving. If you don't have that hormone balance, then you'll often not get that correct pelvic development, which can lead to calving difficulty in younger, if you're trying to calve at 2. There's just all these unintended consequences. looking at eye muscle area as well, that people often talk about this now, but eye muscle area is also antagonistic to calving ease. So you're likely to get more calving difficulty. People selecting for weaning weight. Well, are you selecting for the growth in the animal, the hormone, or are you selecting for the hormone balance? Are you selecting for changes in that, or are you selecting for more milk in the dam? And that could, if you change the milk in the dam, which increases weaning weight, you could then be just selecting for more energy requirements for the cow, which then make her energy requirements higher than what the environment can produce. So you've got to be careful with all these things when you're selecting. I remember a breeder saying to me, be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it, and that's is a good example of that. Feed efficiency, are you selecting for more growth in bone, more growth in lean muscle? Growth in lean muscle and selection for that led to us having lean muscle and not a very good eating product, and because there wasn't any intramuscular fat in it. And then we had to select for marbling. But we only have a problem with marbling because we selected for lean muscle mass. You also have to be really careful selecting for marbling. If you think about native cattle, native Herefords, Galloway, you name it, most of our native breeds, Aberdeen Angus, obviously, but the true native lines, there was never a problem in eating quality. There was never a problem with marbling. We didn't need to look at it. We only created that problem when we selected for excessive lean muscle mass. But then people selected for lean muscle mass and growth rate and marbling. And this has caused an issue with hormone balance and fertility in bulls, because a really hormonally balanced bull will be and a fertile bull will be reasonably high in testosterone, which is antagonistic to marbling. And so in the mature bulls, you have to be really careful about what you're selecting for, because you've been selecting against fertility in your bulls, and that's going to cause big problems for you. But I think if we hadn't created the problem in the first place, we wouldn't even need to look at marbling. As many of us in grass-fed production know how good our native cattle are in terms of eating quality. You've also got the problems of pairing antagonistic traits. So you might have calving ease and growth rate. So growth rate, you're going to get bigger animals, but calving ease, you don't want bigger animals when the calf's coming out. And so when they initially selected for the numbers on calving ease, they just selected on the animals that were born easily, and they were selecting for growth rate at the same time. So you ended up with animals that grew very tall but were very narrow in the hips, and they were born easily. The problem is the heifers that grew up that were very tall and narrow, that grew and were born easily, but they had narrow hips. So they had calving problems. So selection for calving ease had the unintended consequence of causing calving problems. They had to then adjust that to have a new measure, which was calving ease daughters, to take account of this. And even now, it's not perfect. And most people, even the people using EBVs certainly in Aberdeen Angus, accept that the calving ease figures are effectively meaningless. Gestation length was affected. So if you're selecting for growth rate and calving ease, then if animals are just born prematurely, then they're smaller, they come out, and so then you've got a lack of vigor at birth, and then that causes all sorts of knock-on other problems as well. So nothing is free, everything is trade-off. There's limited energy. We don't have a magic wand. The environment is limited, and we're constrained by it, and we need animals that just produce within the sweet spot of what the environment produces. I'll just skip some of through this because a lot of you are aware. So I'll just come through. So just a quick note to say that just looking at the data, age at first calving of 24 months and a subsequent calving interval of 365 days is obviously what we're aiming for. It's very doable. It does take time. If you're calving at 3, for example, then I think you need to. There's a different presentation I have on selection and culling, and without going broke, because you can quickly lose a lot of animals when you make the switch over if you haven't done some work beforehand. But we want a tight calving block as well, and we want lower labour costs. That tight calving block, calving is when we've got the most labour costs, so we want that tight block so it's not happening for too long, And then we've also got a cohort of calves that are similar age that will grow at the same rate. If you do treat them for anything, then at least they're all the same age, and that helps. And we just look at the heifer development. Here, this is should maybe get some newer pictures, but you can see a heifer at 11 months. She's 3 months before she's going to be bred. But look at the change in her when she's just 3 months in calf. That's just between April and December of the same year. That's the change in the animal when she has the summer at grass. You can see she's not got great condition on the left-hand side, but look how she's changed. A great grass animal, real depth of body, and she's going to do her first calf really well. So the true cost of pushing for the birth weights and the growth weights, or the growth rates rather, is looking at the individual animal. We end up causing problems and interventions. And a cesarean or a difficult calving is the biggest predictor of future calving problems. So you're creating your own future problems as well. It's also very likely the stress of that is going to mean that she's not going to get in calf on time. She's going to need 6 months off, and that's why people often calve twice a year. So they'll have an autumn and spring calving, because cows can move between the two herds when they need a rest. That's not, if you're only producing a calf every 18 months, or they're switching too often, then it's not a profitable system. So if you focus on the whole calf crop rather than the individual, then you'll be much better off. So if we look at fertility impact on the business, 75% weaned versus 95% weaned on 100 cows, that's 20 calves. That's an extra 6 tons at weaning. This is huge. 20 calves sold at 18 months old at £1,000 a head. Actually, I think the last autumn, Lizzie sold her stores at that age at, I think, something like £1,300 a head. So maybe a bit above that. So, those extra 20 calves, it's a serious amount of money. Now you try and make that 25,000 up with growth rate on individual calves, which almost certainly push down your weaning percentages. And these are percentages of calves per cow put to the bull. A lot of people will PD the animals, get rid of the empties, and then say they've got 95% calving or 98% calving percentage. That it has to be those that are put to the bull to know how that's working. I've often found that the high production herds are often not even getting to that 75% without a lot of inputs. Okay, we've talked a little bit about that. The difference in cohort size, if you've got 3 months between calves, you've got an animal 3 months, let's say that's close to 100 days, putting on a kilo a day. So your calf from the beginning of the calving compared to the end of calving, you can have 100 kilos difference. That's free money right there if you just have them all born at the start. So having tight calving pattern on fertility is huge. So we'll just go through this. And then we just think about, in terms of calving age, what nature does. So if we look at all these common mammals that we have, you can see as you increase in size, you can see the age at first birth. You increase in size, you increase in the age that they first have their first calf or first baby, whatever. And it's because they have to get the growing done first before they can then finish the growing. Reproductive hormones dominate the growth hormones, and then then they have the secondary sexual characteristics develop, and they're ready to have a calf. And so you can see the red deer and the cow line, it's 2 or 3 years old, depending on the environment. So in really harsh environments, actually they'll breed at 3 or have their first calf at 3. And so, it's just worth paying attention to that, to think about what environment we're in. This is the Cotswold group. So we live in, possibly have the best environment for farming you could ever hope for in the UK. So I think we should be aiming for calving at 2. Okay, so if we accept that fertility is really important, and I've talked a little bit about deer populations already, but what is fertility? If you look at the science and the research that's been done on fertility, it's almost always linked very closely to body condition. So essentially, it's linked to, in many ways, it's linked to whether the animal is in a position to breed. So there's a difference between inherent fertility and adaptive fertility. And I think inherent fertility is if an animal gets in calf, if we're talking about cows, gets in calf no matter what her situation on energy requirements and available energy. So she'll get in calf no matter what. But that means that that process is just going to take her on a downward spiral. She's going to go down and down and down and lose more and more body condition. She'll be inherently fertile, but if she's not matched to the environment, then she's not going to survive long term, and she's not going to be a profitable animal. And eventually, she's going to come up open. And so it's not surprising when breeding has such a huge energy cost that in terms of survival and adaptation through evolution, that adaptive fertility is what has essentially been selected for, not just when we're mammals, but much further back in our evolutionary history. If you go back to even sort of, eventually we go back down our evolutionary history, you get to crustaceans, you get to, even before that, essentially reproduction has a huge energy cost. And so there's been a very early adaptation a long time ago in our evolutionary history that our reproductive success or our fecundity is going to be linked very closely to the available energy in the environment. And so we'll have adaptive fertility. And I think that's hardwired from a long way back. It's hard to change. So the fertility in relation to body condition is absolutely key. So you need an animal that does react and that is adaptive. If it's just inherent fertility, then it's not going to adapt. I've had these animals that will breed no matter what, and you think this is a really good thing to reproduce because she's so fertile. But what you probably need to do is take out some of the production and performance from her and put maybe a smaller bull, smaller animal on her to take some of the production away, take some of that fertility with her, but then you've got an animal coming from her that then is going to replace her but has slightly less performance and therefore slightly less maintenance requirements on a smaller animal that is therefore going to be able to live in the environment and do the job fine. There's a great quote there from Hayden and Weinstein on adaptive evolution. And this is essentially about no such thing as a hardy animal. It's about the fit of creatures to their environment. So you can see that fitness and reproductive success were considered synonyms. However, if an individual animal produces many offspring, all of which die in the winter, we're likely come to understand that it failed in an evolutionary sense. So that's essentially what I'm talking about. Animals that have adaptive fertility, that adapt to the environment, are more successful. So all else being equal, a creature that's better fit for the environment tends to produce more offspring. So, but what happens when all else isn't equal? The creature with more offspring has cut corners in the pursuit of short-term fecundity. Then, they all die or they stop breeding because they just get too poor and weak and thin to breed or survive, or they get taken out by a predator. So we have to think about what are the unexpected consequences of a big cow producing a big calf every year within an environment. There's good and bad potentially from that, but what are the risks that we're doing if we try and follow that? So we know that fertility is not just the inherited genetics of the ancestor, it's also the genetic experience of previous generations. So that's the epigenetics. So you have the DNA code, but it's also the history through 10, 3, 20 generations that have switched on and off different genes within the genome that give us the adaptation that we now have. So with what we know about the importance of the female line now, what does that mean for your breeding strategy? We've talked about red deer already, but if we think about when you go and look at your cows this week, you're going to look at Maybe you're going to look at which ones are holding body condition at the end of this terrible winter. Which ones have got, maybe you're not going to look for the ones that have the biggest calves. Maybe you're going to look for the ones that have the healthiest calves that are right in the middle of the cohort, in the middle of that bell curve of performance. And that's really where you're going to be looking for that healthy animal that's just, it's kind of everything's a walk in the park. Good structure as well, really important. And then I think just really interesting to really understand the impact of epigenetics as well, and the fact that, you know, that adaptive evolution happens over generations and generations. So that environmental fit happens over a long period of time and is fixed more and more the more years that they are run in those kinds of systems. So, you know, essentially you're talking about the lineage of an animal. And this is the sort of magic and beauty of DNA and of the mitochondrial DNA, is that it's essentially, you know, however millions of pair bonds there are through that, through the DNA strands, and which ones are switched on and off is actually, it's like a story. That DNA strand carries the story that that animal has had, not only in its life, but in all the previous generations that have gone before it. So it's an incredible store of history, essentially, that the animal and all of us animals have, with all the things we've encountered in the past, and we can therefore adapt to in the future. So it's fascinating when you think of it like that. But if we think about what we have in terms of adaptation, what is actually happening with adaptation? So we talked a little bit about the thickness of hides and dealing with the cold, but there's also, if we think about comparative anatomy, structure is really important in terms of efficiency. So there are actually quite, if you look at athletes and the success of certain athletes, it's in certain disciplines, you'll see that the attachment point of muscles is very different. You can actually change how we move. We all know about, you know, some people move very well. They've got very good, you know, with horses, people talk about conformation, how well they move. They move in a straight line, and the efficiency of that movement has an impact on the energy required to move. And if you're walking up and down hills or mountains or just around fields going for water in the cold, that has an impact. So that comparative anatomy, you're selecting for good structure. But even when we talked about earlier the wide heart girth, so the comparative anatomy, you can have differences in the circulatory system. So you might have one person's sort of aorta or jugular vein might go on a more circuitous route around the neck, around the body. It might take longer for that blood to be taken to where it needs to be got to. Some routes, in some people, that route will, the circulatory system will be more efficient. It'll get there quicker and easier. You know, the constriction of the blood vessels. Around every blood vessel in our body is a muscle that's pumping as well as our heart's pumping, but there's the contraction, expansion of those blood vessels. And some people are going to have just slightly thicker muscles around their blood vessels. Some people can have bigger hearts. Some people have bigger lungs. All of these things have an impact. And so we can adapt for these beneficial things, but often bigger muscles, bigger hearts might also come with higher energy requirement. So we have to be careful, and we try and look for where the big wins are and make sure we are adapted and we fit our environment. That's the key thing. So if we think about the fact, and we look at that Belgian blue bull that can't walk, and we think, what selection criteria have we just thrown out the window with our focus on numbers and measurement? Because science, if you can measure it, you can manage it, apparently. But there's still a place for the stockman and stockwoman to look at the locomotion of an animal and see if it moves well, and see if it moves in an efficient energy. You can see some cows, it almost looks like it's, there's one cow I can think of that we bought from, well, I won't say who it is, but it's always the last one through the paddock. It almost looks like it's a real trial for it to walk anywhere. It just takes so much energy. And And then Lizzie's looking at me because she knows who that is. But you can look at the rumen capacity and the efficiency of the rumen, the ability to convert what food they get into energy. We talked about the vital organ capacity, but also hormone balance in terms of the balance of growth rate with the reproductive hormones. So there's a lot of these things we can look for with our eyes. So there's still a place for stockmanship. So we're really looking at not just inherent fertility, that's helpful, but we need to look at physiology, the metabolic efficiency, and the metabolic pull that we have on the energy of the animal. So if we accept that it's not just inherent fertility, but it's adaptive fertility, which relates not just to the hormone balance, but actually to the energy requirements of the animal within its environment as well. So we must breed animals that find the energy cost of reproductive success well within the boundaries of the available environment. Seasons change, but we must maintain fertility. We must maintain production. We have these bad winters, but we still need a calf crop to sell. And that means animals with low energy requirements for maintenance, with plenty left for reproduction afterwards. We can get growth rate from the terminal line. We just don't keep the heifers, don't keep them as replacements. Those little cows put on one of those high growth, easy calving Angus bulls, and they'll wean a calf almost as big as themselves. You'll lose almost nothing in growth rate. You'll keep 2 of those cows to the big cows that bred the bull that brought the calf. So, there's a much better system for profitability if you look at that. And in terms of welfare as well, animals that find it a walk in the park in these systems, animals that calve themselves correctly and pair bond properly, you think about the importance of that for animal welfare. When I first got into Angus cattle and, a lot of the lines, the high productive lines that I had, I remember getting the vet out to pull a calf that the vet pulled and kept going, and then you heard the pelvis crack. The cow let out an almighty moan, and then it lay down. We got it out of the crush, and then it just lay down. The calf survived. 2 hours later, the cow was dead, and I was, that was another cow I'd lost. Felt terrible about the impact on the animal, huge impact on the business as well. And I just remember sat on the floor, leaning against her, thinking that, it's not good enough. We can do an awful lot better than this. These animals provide us with our living. We owe it to them to try and make it so that what we provide for them, they fit within that. And if we have ego on production that leads us to cesareans or pulling calves, I've heard someone say, I can't remember where I heard it the other day. Someone was saying that if you don't have to pull a calf, it'll never turn into anything good. But there's a real responsibility, and it's never been more important for us to be able to tell good stories about what we do. And I think if we're not looking after the cow's interest, then we should be really taking a look at ourselves, really. I'll get off my soapbox now. So how can we select these profitable and more humane traits in cattle? So monitoring selection, there's a time element, isn't there? So this is one of the reasons that people like estimated breeding values and the figures and the numbers, is because you can look at a calf and you can calculate its numbers and it should tell you exactly how it's going to do. Whereas if you really want to know if an animal's any good with just monitoring, then you're probably going to have to wait till that cow is 10 years old and she's had a calf every year. And then she's a good one. It's a long time to wait before you then select the bulls out of those cows, isn't it? Over time you can get there, but you can save time with visual assessment. And that's where Dr. Jan Bonsma comes in. So he had a research background. I think it was Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And he looked at the breeding performance of about 40,000 cows. And then he just looked at the physical attributes, physical assessment of all of those animals in terms of their skeleton. And on those 40,000 cows, he looked at whether they'd bred or not, how often they'd bred, if they'd bred every year. And then he went over to America, and they ran 1,000 cows through the ring. And he was able to look at those cows as they ran through the ring, each one. And 85% of them, he was 100% correct on whether it had bred, how many calves it had, what age it had bred at, whether it had been flushed for embryos and had hormone treatment for that. So it's a pretty good test of whether it was accurate. And we can kind of look at how he did that, and he wrote a book about it, and you can get a lot of this quite cheaply online now. Initially, 6 or 7 years ago, I think that his book was selling about, I think I bought it for about 180 quid. But last time I saw it on eBay, it was the original editions was about 1,800 quid. So he seems to have come to the fore a bit more. He's passed away now. But you can get, if you look at the Wortham lectures, I think you can find a PDF of that, which you should be able to. Okay, and I think Lizzie's telling me there's a book on Amazon for $3.99. So there you go. So yeah, we talked about environmental adaptation, all the things we provide in terms of hard feed, high energy feed, energy cost intensive forage, all of these things, minerals, wormers, vaccines, weaning early, housing the animals. So bondsman's wheel, you're not letting her interact with her environment. She's not going to adapt. So all of these are physiological cues for the animal being functionally efficient in her environment. And so that has an impact on the hormone balance, on the growth rate, on the energy production, energy use. And so if you think about what we talked about with growth rate and the impact, we've talked about long bones and growth plates and how that all works. But the hormone balance also has an impact on skeletal development. So if the long bones, we talked about how when they get to the age of breeding and then the reproductive maturity, so the reproductive hormones dominate the growth hormones, the growth plates on the long bones close, and then you get the secondary reproductive characteristics. Well, obviously, if those long bones stop growing and you're getting secondary reproductive characteristics in the animal, that animal is going to look different to one where the long bones just kept growing. And so we can look at that, and it'll give us an idea. So if you look at some of the pictures here, you've got a steer at the top castrated at 6 months. And then you've got one castrated at 2 years, which is looking more bull-like. Look at the extra growth in the animal at the top in its front leg through to shoulder. And also look in terms of the head carriage and the shoulder angle. And all of these things actually have a real big impact on lameness, because if your shoulder angle or your hip angle is wrong, then you're likely to get problems in the hoof. A lot of foot problems are actually structure problems. And you can see the bull at the bottom showing more balance and less extreme growth. We look at a beautiful Jersey cow. The cow at the top never had a calf, never got in calf. And you can see the cow at the bottom. You can see that wedge shape. You can see, it's interesting as well that, what my father taught me about looking at a good animal, or not my father really, but when you're looking at an animal that is in the pen winning the Christmas fat stock, it's that you might look at heifers that look a bit more masculine, a bit more bulky, they've got more flesh and muscling, and that draws the eye. And I even still now have to stop myself when looking at that as a good thing, particularly in the female line. But you can see the crest on the neck on the top of the top one, and you've got more of a U neck, as in like a sheep's U neck on the neck of the cow. You much finer shoulder as well. Again, can you see people talk about sharp and round? So the round female is low fertility, and then the sharp female at the bottom is high fertility. And you can kind of see what they're talking about when they say that. So this is the cow we saw earlier on, Elenka, perfect udder. But you're also looking at quite a feminine neck, not a bulky crest or anything on that. You've got a prominent shoulder, and a great shoulder angle. You've also got a slope from hook to pin, so from a hip bone back to the pin bone just underneath her tail. Now, some people don't like a high tail, but I think what's far more important than the tail height is, or the tail placement, is the slope from hook to pin. Because if that's sloping, then essentially any, after calving, any draining from the womb through the vagina is going to drain. And unfortunately, through the show ring, we've selected for completely level top lines, which is why we've ended up with higher tails, but we've also ended up with high pin bones. And if that womb cannot drain after calving, then that's going to lead to problems and potential breeding problems in the future as well. It's a very practical reason. But you also want to slope there in order to get the correct angle from the pin bone and the thurl into the stifle and then into the hock, to make sure you've got the right balance and all those angles going down the hind leg. So if we're not careful with it, we can screw that up quite easily. One of the reasons we want a prominent shoulder as well, but is because the chine bones on top of the spine, if it's got high growth rate and the growth hormones are dominating for longer, then those chine bones will overtop the top of the shoulder, and we can have a look at some of that. So if you look at the first picture, you can see the chine bones above the scapula are growing much higher and almost shielding the scapula. And when that scapula rotates, when the animal walks, you won't be able to see the shoulder or the scapula rotating above the spine. But on the right-hand side, you'll notice that it will do. And that's because the growth rates on those long bones, the reproductive hormones effectively dominated the growth hormones at a younger age before those bones had a chance to grow that long. So that's a tell. So you can go and look at all your cows now and see if it's got a prominent shoulder, and you can see which ones have got the prominent spine above the shoulder. And that'll tell you an awful lot about the growth rates on the animals. You can see how people talk about fine-boned cows being more fertile, and you get the same when people talk about horses. Those who've been involved in horses talking about flat bone, good flat bone in an animal, particularly in a mare, is a really good thing. Sort of a sign of fertility and strength, and health in many ways. We'll go through some pictures. These are pictures taken from Darius Meitler, from Meitler Cattle Company, his father worked with Bonsma. But again, you can see a slope from hook to pin, prominent shoulder, but lots of capacity for a grass-fed animal. And if we look at the difference, and a lot of people, again, you can go wrong measuring for pelvic measurements, and some breeds have gone down the route of measuring for pelvic measurements, and they look at the width within the pelvic opening, and by making the pelvic opening wider and wider, they've made the cow bigger and bigger. So those cows that used to be, I won't say which breed, but they used to be quite nice little maternal cows, and they're now huge maternal cows. They are still quite good maternal cows, but they're widening and widening. The pelvic cavity makes bigger cows. Whereas if you actually look at having more of a slope, the picture on the right there, you can see the skeleton having the pin bone lower and the slope from hook to pin creates more space between the tailbones, and when those pin bones drop just before calving, it provides more space for the animal. You can also, if you have a look at the femur, you might notice as well that one of the reasons why that pin bone is higher, and because you've got growth rate, you can look at the femur on the left is much longer because of the growth rate, and that's changed the angles. You end up with post-legged bulls, so the tibia as well is longer, and the metatarsus and the femur, and so that means you get a much straighter leg, and it pushes the pin bone up and means you've got less room for calving. So growth rate's got a lot to answer for, but if we want functional cows, we need to look at that. Here's another of our cows. Again, you can see the slope from hook to pin. You can see that prominent shoulder carrying really good condition into calving, perfect udder. That's really what we want. That calf's not very old. I think that's a day or so old. So, that's really what we're looking for.
Rob, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm aware that we're sort of getting close to 8:30 now, and I just wondered if we wanted to make a bit of room for questions, although I feel like it's been so informative, and I don't want to interrupt if everyone's happy continuing. But yeah, I don't know. Does anyone have any questions at this point, or do you want to round up perhaps, Rob? And then
I'll round up quickly, and I'll just finish on this structure point because everyone can kind of look at this.
Thank you.
This is I'll just have a look at this cow. It's a big cow, really broad muzzle you can see on her, which we love in a cow, and you can see the prominent shoulder. She's a big cow, but even so that she's a big cow, you can see these physical traits. She's got, again, calf's not very old, perfect udder, nice slope to the hip. Now you might think, okay, well, this great big calf, she produces a big calf as well. So conventional thinking would be we want more like her. So we'll breed a bull, similar line to her, back to her to get more like her. But actually what we'll do is we'll take a big cow that has fertility. We do have some big cows that have performed in the system. But what we then do is breed them to our smaller bulls. So we want her line, but we just want to take a little bit of production out. Because what we tend to find is these outliers, these big cows that are the centerpiece of the promotion and all the marketing of all the high EBV, high numbered cattle. What we find is they don't replace themselves. So she can hack it and she's an outlier, but probably only 20% of her heifers will be like her. And you need 100% of her heifers to be like her. So rather than try and recreate her, we'll try and create a smaller version that has a lower energy requirement. So then the ongoing offspring from her daughters will all be cows that 100% of the heifers work rather than 20%, which we tend to find that 80-20 rule works with the outliers as a rule. I won't go through too much more. There's some of our heifers in Wales that have gone out to a farm that breeds pedigree cattle there. And again, you'll see a type as I'm going through. You've got hip slope, you've got prominent shoulder, hip slope, prominent shoulder, just to help you get your eye, see that prominent shoulder above the spine. Plenty of room, length from hook to pin. Herefords as well, some nice Herefords over in the States. And then I'll just finish up on Old Granny. So this was the first Angus cow in the herd book in 1864, something like that. And she died at 33. She had a calf every year until she was 27. So she didn't owe them a lot. I mean, she died at 33. It looks like they might have culled her a bit earlier by the photo, or the painting rather. But I think if you think about all our technology and all our advancements and how clever we think we are with our numbers. So here's a cow, the first cow in the herd book produced a calf every year from 2 to 27. So she's had 25 calves. How far have we come in 160, 170 years? I'm not sure we've come that far, to be honest. So I'll leave it there, and if anyone's got any questions, then fire away.
Rob, thank you so much. I can see your passion that's driven you to research this in such detail, and such an informative presentation. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us. Yeah, the floor is open for questions. If you want to raise your hand and then speak up, that would be great. Do put your questions to Rob. I have a question to get things rolling then. I can see, Rob, that your system is very detailed and incredibly well developed. Are there any sort of things that you could advise someone who's completely new to all of this thinking or these processes? What would be sort of 5 things that you would suggest they start doing or straight away?
I think probably is if you look at your calving record of your cows. So one thing, so my grandfather always used to say that your best ewes or your best cows are the ones you don't know. And it tends to be when we're in farming and animal husbandry that we'll know the cows that you've had to nurse or the calves you've had to help out and those sorts of things. And you build bonds with those animals, and that's lovely for us. but is it lovely to keep breeding animals for what's right for them that have problems? Is it right to keep breeding, and for our back pockets as well? If you look through the history of your animals, you see whether if you had before she had foot problems. You can look at her structure, you can score for structure. You can look at the calving record. If you haven't kept much records, then you can actually pretty much do a lot of that BCMS. If you look at your cows, and you can then link to offspring and things like that. So you can see which ones have had a calf every year, and you can then work out who's really problem free. And then I would look to find your best third of your cows, and then that's where you keep your replacements from. And just keep selecting replacements from those that breed every year, and keep going from there. And you can even, if you get to a point which you should do in 5, 6, 7 years, where you're really struggling to kill animals because they're all staying in the herd problem free, then then you can maybe it's a good problem to have. So you can then start pushing them in terms of inputs. You can then start pushing in terms of system, and you can start pushing the envelope. But we always start off with fertility, and then go from there. If you select everything at once, you won't have much left after 2 or 3 years.
Thanks very much, Rob. Any questions from anyone else? Do feel free to put them in the chat as well if you'd rather not speak up and ask directly.
Well, there's a couple of things in the chat. Okay.
Thank you. Very useful webinar. What I'll do is, while we're waiting to see any questions that pop up, I will thank you again, Rob. Obviously, we can't give you a proper round of applause. Everyone's in different places, but thank you so much for such an informative and detailed presentation. For those of you who've come along, I'd like to plug a follow-up event. So if you're in the Cotswolds, Chilterns and North Wessex Downs, then we're having a visit to Andy Rummings with Rob, so a joint event on the 25th of April. And I'll pop in the chat now a link to be able to sign up to that if you're interested to come along. So the idea is we'll have sort of a practical application of some of the things that Rob's been talking about today, but with using Andy's herd as an example. And then also just to let you know that we've also got an event on soil health at Ampney Brook Farm on the 17th of April as well, with Annie Landless, if you're interested to come along as well. Yeah, I'll just hang on, see if there's any further questions. Otherwise, thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to stop the recording there as well, I think.